13th of May, 1943, Cape Bon Peninsula, Tunisia. The desert sun hammers the baked earth like a blacksmith's mallet. Unteroffizier Hans Waker lowers the bolt on his sand-caked carabiner 98K and wipes his palm against his sweat-soaked tunic. The acrid scent of burnt oil drifts from the carcass of a Panzer IV nearby, its 75mm KWK-40 gun still warm from the last futile exchange. Around him, the Afrika Korps' proud banners droop in the furnace heat as tens of thousands of German and Italian soldiers, some 238,000 to 275,000 by Allied count, shuffle toward the Allied lines. It is the largest single surrender of Axis troops in the West, and the desert wind carries the metallic clank of thrown weapons like distant bells of defeat. Rumors ripple through the ranks like mirages. Some men whisper of Siberian gulags. Others imagine British prison camps where hunger gnaws as fiercely as the flies now biting their faces. Hans keeps his eyes on the horizon, where the olive groves of Cape Bon shimmer beneath the noon sun. He had trusted Rommel's reputation, the old desert fox, but Rommel is gone, and the 5th Panzer Army lies broken. The 88mm flak guns that once spat fire at British armor stand abandoned, their barrels drooping toward the sand like spent lances. Across the battlefield, Captain James Hollis of the U.S. Army Provost Marshal's office walks the captured lines with the quiet authority of a man who has seen chaos before. He notes serial numbers, marks unit designations, and directs the careful separation of officers from enlisted men. Hollis knows these prisoners will not remain in North Africa. Britain cannot spare the food or guards. America, its shipping lanes now flowing east and west, will take them. The Americans issue water from 5-gallon jerry cans while a nearby destroyer escort signals the harbor. Its sonar gear and hedgehog mortar, tools of a navy that has strangled the U-boat menace, speak of technological confidence. Hans watches sailors hand out white bread and coffee. The rich aroma unsettles him more than the guards' rifles. Even in victory, he had never smelled such plenty. As the sun sinks, the first Liberty ship eases into the bay, her gray hull streaked with salt. She is one of 2,710 such vessels, steel cargo giants built in as little as 42 days each, proof that the enemy's factories work with a speed that outpaces imagination. Chains rattle as gangways drop. The prisoners will cross an ocean they had only known as a distant idea on a map. Hans shoulders his pack, staring at the ship's welded seams that gleam like silver scars in the twilight. He cannot know that this voyage will shatter every certainty he has carried from the Reich. Behind him, the desert wind dies, replaced by the low, relentless thrum of American engines, a sound that will follow him across the Atlantic. The Liberty ship's boilers rumble to life beneath an Atlantic sky thick with moonless cloud. Salt spray slicks the steel deck as Hans Waker grips the cold rail, the smell of bunker oil heavy in the night. Around him, hundreds of captured Germans huddle in heavy greatcoats, their breath white in the wind. Beneath the deck plates, turbines drive the vessel westward, part of a convoy shielded by destroyer escorts, whose sonar pings cut through the dark like invisible spears. Each night, the convoy runs silent drills. Hedgehog mortars, spigot-fired arrays of 24-pound bombs, stand ready to crash into the ocean should a U-boat's shadow be glimpsed. The ship's whistle shrieks at midnight, a note both warning and promise. Hans, who once trusted the Kriegsmarine's vaunted wolf packs, watches in uneasy awe as American anti-submarine warfare displays a precision his own Navy has failed to match. On deck, U.S. sailors share cigarettes and pour steaming coffee from dented metal thermoses. The aroma, rich, almost sweet, rides the wind to the prisoner's corner. It smells of a comfort Hans has not known since before the war. Some of the men mutter disbelief. In Germany, coffee is rationed to a bitter substitute. Here, it seems endless. Below decks, in the cramped hold, the prisoners sleep to the heartbeat of triple expansion engines, whose pistons drive at a pace Germany cannot match. Among the guards is Corporal Rupert Trimmingham, a black American soldier from Louisiana. He keeps a steady watch, Springfield rifle slung across his shoulder. Even as the irony bites, enemy prisoners eat and sleep under the same flag that forces him, a U.S. citizen in uniform, to endure segregation when off duty. He offers no complaint, but Hans notices the quiet dignity in the way Trimmingham stands his post. Days stretch into a gray routine: lifeboat drills, canned rations, the ceaseless drone of machinery. Hans peers through the salt haze at the convoy stretching to the horizon, dozens of Liberty and Victory ships, each a floating warehouse. He recalls the boast that Germany would starve Britain into submission. Yet these American-built ships, welded in 40 days or less, have turned the Atlantic into an assembly line of war. At dawn on the seventh day, the fog lifts to reveal the faint outline of the Statue of Liberty. Sunlight flashes on her torch as gulls wheel overhead. Hans grips the rail, the wind stiff with the scent of land. He had been told America was decadent and weak, yet the evidence thunders beneath his feet. An industrial democracy that builds ships faster than U-boats can sink them. Behind him, the Liberty ship's engines keep their relentless beat, carrying him toward a captivity unlike anything he or his commanders ever imagined. The train brakes with a metallic squeal that echoes across the Texas prairie, the late summer air heavy with honeysuckle and the faint tang of coal smoke. Hans Wecker squints through the barred window as the convoy of boxcars jerks to a halt. After the long crossing and days of rail travel, the sudden stillness feels almost unnatural. A cicada's rasping buzz rises from the brush, an alien sound to a soldier of northern Europe. He gathers his duffel, stepping into a sunlight so fierce it turns the rails into ribbons of molten silver. Camp Hearn sprawls ahead like a small town ringed by double fences. The United States Army has laid it out with military precision, neat rows of weathered wooden barracks, each marked with stenciled numbers, a mess hall already scented with frying bacon, a parade ground shimmering in the heat. Overhead, the Texas sky is a hard, endless blue. For a man raised under the softer skies of Bremen, the horizon seems to go on forever. Major General Allen W. Gullion's directives, drafted under the office of the Provost Marshal General, are visible in every detail. Guards of the 184th Military Police stand at easy intervals, rifles shouldered but bayonets sheathed. Geneva Convention rules hang on a board by the gate, translated into crisp German. A sergeant collects names and unit designations with the calm efficiency of a banker closing his ledgers. Hans notes the order and the courtesy, no shouted threats, no blows. Inside the wire, the golden cage, as some prisoners will later call it, reveals itself. Wooden bunks are stacked with clean straw mattresses, each prisoner issued a khaki blanket and a bar of soap. A Red Cross inspector records the rations, over 3,200 calories per day, more than many German civilians can dream of in 1943. When the dinner bell clangs, the aroma of real coffee and white bread drifts across the yard. To Hans, it is both a comfort and a challenge to everything Nazi propaganda promised. Miles to the north in Iowa, Maggie O'Donnell reads a notice in the local paper. German prisoners will be available for autumn sugar beet harvest. Her husband is off with the Navy, her children too young for the heavy work. She runs a hand across the worn wood of the kitchen table and wonders what it will mean to have enemy soldiers in her fields. As the Texas night settles, cicadas give way to the croak of frogs from a nearby creek. Hans sips his first mug of genuine American coffee, strong, dark, almost sweet, and feels a strange unease. He has come expecting deprivation and humiliation. Instead, under a sky dense with stars, he senses that this enemy land holds something far more dangerous to Nazi certainty: the quiet confidence of a nation that can afford generosity. Morning sunlight spills across the camp's baseball diamond, turning the red dust to copper. Hans Wecker leans on the fence, watching fellow prisoners swing at pitches with a clumsy enthusiasm. The crack of a bat carries across the compound, a sound that belongs more to summer leisure than to war. Beyond the double rows of barbed wire, A farmer's tractor rumbles toward the horizon, its engine a steady counterpoint to the game's laughter. Daily life in the camp settles into rhythms that would have astonished Hans a month earlier. Canteen shelves brim with cigarettes, chocolate, and newspapers. Luxuries Germany now rations to crumbs. Prisoners earn 80 cents a day in scrip for farm or maintenance work. The U.S. government billing contractors 45 cents an hour for their labor. It is money that buys coffee, candy, and even small gifts to send home, though every letter will pass beneath the black pencil of a German censor before it reaches Bremen. Corporal Rupert Trimmingham, Springfield rifle slung with casual discipline, watches the game from the guard tower. He notes the prisoners' easy camaraderie and the smell of real coffee rising from the mess hall. Off-duty, he cannot enter many of the same restaurants where captured Germans are served without question. The irony stings, but he holds his post with quiet professionalism. Hans, writing a letter to his sister, describes the mess hall's white bread and the unending supply of meat and vegetables. He pauses, aware that in Hamburg his family lines up for meager rations and ersatz coffee. He chooses his words carefully, knowing that Nazi censors will strike through any overt praise of the enemy. Still, he cannot resist one sly phrase. The food is excellent and the clothing adequate, a truth hidden in plain sight. From the guard tower, Trimmingham thinks of home and the contradictions of the nation he serves. America can outproduce the Axis in tanks and aircraft. 96,318 warplanes in 1944 alone, yet struggles to treat all its citizens equally. He wonders whether these prisoners see the same paradox. As the sun sinks and the baseball game ends, Hans folds his letter and hands it to the camp clerk. Somewhere in the Reich, a censor's pencil will soon blacken its brightest lines. Yet the aroma of the evening meal drifts through the cooling air, and Hans knows that the memory of abundance will survive any censorship. Freight yards rumbled like distant thunder as dawn light bled across the Kansas plains. Hans Wecker, bundled against the morning chill, paused with his work crew while a mile-long train clattered past. Boxcars groaned under the weight of grain sacks and crated machinery. The smell of creosote and hot steel hung heavy in the air. Every few minutes, another locomotive whistle split the silence, a sound of tireless momentum. Hans had grown up with the cautious, measured pace of a German rail system throttled by wartime scarcity. This was something else entirely, an industrial heartbeat that never slowed. Captain James Hollis stood beside the track, taking in the sight with the eye of a man trained to measure power, not in speeches, but in tonnage. He knew the figures by heart. The U.S. Red Ball Express, formed after the Normandy landings, was now moving 12,500 tons of supplies each day to the European front, more in a single week than the Wehrmacht could push across all of France in a month. Hollis let the numbers speak for themselves, a quiet proof of what American production could achieve. Hans worked the day's shift, loading sugar beets for transport, the earthy sweetness of the crop mixing with the acrid scent of coal smoke. Around him, tractors larger than any he had seen in Germany churned the fields. Some machines were the size of small houses, their diesel engines growling with an ease that mocked the shortages of his homeland. In Bremen, his family now queued for rationed bread. Here, grain elevators filled faster than the eye could follow. During a break, a guard poured coffee from a battered thermos and offered Hans a cup. The dark liquid steamed in the cold air, rich and unending. Hans sipped and said nothing, but the thought pressed in. Even in captivity, the enemy fed him better than his own nation fed its citizens. Overhead, a formation of training aircraft buzzed, a fleeting silver cross of contrails. Hollis, catching Hans's upward glance, remarked almost casually that American factories had produced 96,318 warplanes in 1944 alone. It was a number so vast it felt impossible, a statistic that dwarfed the Luftwaffe's best years. Later, as the train's last car vanished into the horizon, Hans wiped the soot from his hands and studied the empty track gleaming in the sunset. In that single convoy, he sensed the scale of the United States. Liberty and Victory ships built faster than U-boats could sink them, Sherman tanks rolling off assembly lines by the tens of thousands, and supply chains that turned distance into a trivial nuisance. The war, he realized, was already lost, not because German soldiers lacked courage, but because America had turned industry itself into a weapon. The locomotive's echo faded into the prairie dusk, leaving only the steady hiss of cooling rails. Hans felt the weight of an unspoken truth settle over him like the evening dew. The Reich could not fight arithmetic. Winter wind rattled the windows of a wooden barracks at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, as a printing press clanked to life. Inside, the smell of ink and machine oil mixed with the faint sweetness of hot chocolate from the camp canteen. Hans Wecker watched as German prisoners fed paper into the rollers, each sheet emerging with the bold masthead of Der Ruf, the call. He had been transferred east weeks earlier, and the air here carried the briny tang of the Atlantic instead of the dry dust of Texas. The Special Projects Division of the Office of the Provost Marshal General oversaw every detail. Their mission was clear: re-educate Germany's captured soldiers, offer them the intellectual tools for a democratic future. The editors, themselves former Wehrmacht men, debated headlines and selected essays that championed freedom of thought. A 76-page OPMG guide lay open on the desk, its margins marked with careful notes. The Americans believed that words, shaped and sharpened like bayonets, could wound the ideology that had led these men to war. Hans listened to an editor read aloud a passage from Thomas Mann, banned in the Reich, but here freely printed. The cadence of the prose, the daring critique of dictatorship, struck him harder than any Allied shell. He remembered his own letters home, clipped and censored by Nazi officials, and felt the first tremor of a dangerous thought. Perhaps the Reich feared ideas more than it feared bombs. Captain Hollis entered quietly, a clipboard tucked under his arm. He surveyed the room with the pride of a man who understood that victory required more than weapons. Outside, the Red Ball Express still moved thousands of tons of supplies each day. Inside, these prisoners confronted a different freight, arguments and ideals that would outlast the war. Hollis explained how hardcore Nazis had been sent to segregation camps like Alva, Oklahoma, so that moderates could speak without intimidation. Later, Hans lingered near the press as the final copies of Der Ruf stacked neatly on a wooden table. The ink was still damp, the pages warm from the rollers. He lifted one, feeling its weight, a simple newspaper carrying a message as potent as any artillery barrage. Beyond the barracks, the Atlantic wind howled, carrying the salt of distant seas. Hans held the paper to his chest, understanding that this quiet campaign of words was itself a weapon, and that it might prove the most decisive blow America ever struck. Frost glittered across the Iowa fields like a scatter of ground glass when Maggie O'Donnell stepped from her farmhouse at dawn. The November air cut sharp and clean, the smell of wood smoke and cold earth mingling with the faint sweetness of sugar beets waiting in long brown rows. Her husband was still somewhere in the Pacific with the Navy, and the harvest, 15 tons of beets per acre by county estimate, would have rotted in the ground without help. That help arrived in the form of a rattling army truck, its canvas sides flapping as it bounced down the dirt road. Hans Wecker and a dozen fellow prisoners climbed out under the watch of a young military policeman. They wore standard-issue denim work clothes, the letters PW stenciled in black across their backs. Their boots crunched on the frozen soil as they moved toward the waiting rows. Maggie studied their faces, some barely older than her own brother, searching for the menace wartime posters promised. Instead, she saw the tired wariness of men who had laid down their arms months ago on a distant continent. The work began quickly. Hans hefted a steel beat knife, its blade glinting in the pale light, and joined the rhythm of cutting and tossing. His breath hung white in the air, the soil smelled rich and damp, a scent he had almost forgotten after the salt and dust of North Africa and the baked plains of Texas. The farm's old John Deere tractor chugged beside the rows, its two-cylinder engine coughing like a patient giant. To Hans it looked impossibly large, its green paint still glossy after years of use. German farms back home struggled to keep even small machines running on rationed fuel and scavenged parts. During the mid-morning break, Maggie poured coffee from a blue enamel pot and passed out slices of pie. The steam curled into the cold, like a silent benediction. Hans accepted the mug with a small bow. He thought of his sister queuing for ration cards in Bremen, and of the bitter barley brew she would call coffee. Here, in enemy territory, the coffee was strong and sweet and seemingly without end. The day wore on. Wagon after wagon filled with beets and rumbled toward the cooperative scale. Maggie calculated that this single crew would deliver more in one day than her entire extended family could have managed in a week. She felt gratitude and something more difficult to name as she watched these enemy soldiers labor with quiet diligence. As twilight settled and the last cart rolled away, Maggie met Hans's eyes and offered a shy smile. He returned it, a brief spark of recognition that transcended language and uniforms. The frost was already creeping back across the fields, but the warmth of shared work lingered, an unexpected alliance forged in the heart of America's abundance. Spring, 1944, brought a soft southern dusk to a small-town rail stop, where Corporal Rupert Trimmingham sat on a wooden bench, uniform jacket buttoned against the evening chill. The air smelled of creosote and fried chicken drifting from the station cafe. Inside, white civilians dined at neatly set tables. 2 German prisoners of war, still marked with PW, were escorted inside and seated without question. Trimmingham, a black American soldier, was told he would have to eat in the kitchen if he wished to stay. The slight was not new. He had endured segregation from Louisiana to Kansas, but tonight the contrast cut deep. The men he guarded, soldiers who had fought to keep democracy chained, were served like guests, while he, a citizen in U.S. uniform, was barred from their company. He left quietly, his Springfield rifle across his shoulder, the bitter taste of humiliation sharper than the evening's coffee. Later, he would write of the incident in a letter that newspapers across the nation would print, sparking debate far beyond the little station. Hans Wecker heard of the letter weeks later from an American guard who passed the story along with a shake of his head. The German prisoners read translations in camp, puzzled and intrigued. Nazi propaganda had portrayed America as a fractured society, but Hans saw something different, a country willing to argue with itself in the open, to expose its own flaws. The contrast to the Reich, where dissent meant prison or worse, was impossible to miss. Captain James Hollis recognized the paradox with a soldier's pragmatism. He knew that in the same year America would produce 96,000 warplanes, more than Germany and Japan combined. Its democracy still wrestled with its own inequities. Yet he also believed that a nation capable of self-criticism was stronger than one built on fear and silence. For Hans, the episode planted a deeper question. If a democracy could be both generous and imperfect, what did that say about the certainties of Nazi ideology? He watched as Americans debated Trimmingham's letter in newspapers and radio broadcasts, some voices demanding change, others defending the old ways. The noise of public argument was, in its own way, as impressive as the roar of the Red Ball Express hauling 12,500 tons of supplies to the front each day. As night settled over the camp, Hans folded his arms and listened to the distant rumble of a passing freight train. The sound carried both power and possibility. In America, even the contradictions were alive with motion. Night settled over Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, on the 4th of November 1943, with a brittle chill that carried the scent of mesquite and wood smoke. The compound lay quiet beneath a waning moon, its double fences throwing long shadows across the hard-packed earth. Inside one barracks, however, tension coiled like barbed wire. A knot of prisoners moved with hushed urgency toward the bunk of fellow German soldier Johannes Kunze. They whispered accusations of betrayal, claims that Kunze had informed on diehards to the American guards. In the fevered code of the Reich, such suspicion was a death sentence. Hans Wacker, posted in a neighboring hut, sensed the disturbance before he heard it. A door creaked, boots scuffed. Then came the muffled thud of fists, a brief cry cut short, and the sudden eerie silence that follows violence. When the guards finally forced the door open, Kunze lay crumpled on the floor, his body bearing the unmistakable marks of a beating. He would not live to see the dawn. Captain James Hollis arrived minutes later, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dark like a saber. He took in the scene with the trained eye of a military policeman, the overturned bunk, the blood on the rough wooden planks, the hard-set faces of the accused. This was no battlefield skirmish, but an execution, an act of terror meant to enforce the old Nazi discipline within American wire. The investigation moved swiftly. Witnesses were questioned under the strict procedures of U.S. Army court-martial law. Hollis knew the Geneva Convention demanded not only humane treatment of prisoners, but also justice when prisoners preyed upon each other. The accused were soon transferred under heavy guard to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where a military court convened. The proceedings, painstakingly documented, reflected the very rule of law that distinguished the United States from the totalitarian system these men once served. On the 10th of July, 1945, after months of careful review, 5 prisoners were found guilty of murder and executed by hanging at Leavenworth's gallows. The Army built the scaffold to military specifications, each rope measured and tested. The trapdoor fell in the pre-dawn hush, a soundless judgment against tyranny and fear. For Hans, the event was a jolt. Even in wartime, America did not answer violence with mob reprisal, but with due process. Outside the camp that night in 1943, the Oklahoma wind moaned through the scrub as if carrying the memory forward. Hans, lying awake on his cot, stared at the shadowed ceiling. He thought of the Reich's secret courts and the casual cruelty of its justice. Here, even the enemy could demand a trial. The sound of the wind through the wire seemed to whisper a truth he could no longer deny. America's strength lay not only in factories and convoys, but in the discipline of its own ideals. A late summer sun glinted off rows of newly crated M4 Sherman tanks lined along a rail spur outside Detroit, their olive-drab hulls catching the light like a parade of armored giants. Captain James Hollis stood at the edge of the platform, the warm metal scent of fresh paint mixing with the oily tang of diesel. To his practiced eye, the scene was more than industrial spectacle. It was the visible proof of a war already won by numbers. He carried in his field notebook the figures that still astonished even seasoned officers. American factories had produced nearly 300,000 military aircraft during the war, 96,318 in 1944 alone, more than the entire combined output of Germany and Japan that year. Shipyards running round the clock launched 2,710 Liberty ships and 531 Victory ships in 4 short years. Steel mills poured more metal in 1944 than the Axis could muster in any 2. These were not statistics on a page, but the engines of global strategy, turning raw democracy into unstoppable force. Hans Wacker, now assigned to a work detail near a Midwestern rail hub, watched a mile-long train of Sherman tanks rattle past. Each 75mm gun barrel gleamed in the fading light, the thrum of diesel locomotives setting the ground vibrating beneath his boots. He thought of the Africa Corps tanks he had once trusted, the Panzer IVs whose production never approached these impossible numbers. One American factory could now turn out in a month what Germany strained to produce in a year. Hollis joined him on the platform, offering a cigarette as the last flat car disappeared into the horizon. He spoke without boasting. "This is what wins wars, Hans." Arithmetic. The words hung in the smoky air like a final verdict. Hans inhaled, the smoke tasting of both tobacco and inevitability. Above them, the sky carried the distant drone of training aircraft, another casual reminder of the nation's vast capacity. Each engine note seemed to underline Hollis's point. In this war, Production was a weapon as decisive as any bomb or bullet. As the sun dipped low, the tank's silhouettes merged with the long shadows of the yard. Hans felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. The Reich had been beaten not only in the deserts of North Africa or the hedgerows of Normandy, but in the mills of Pittsburgh and the shipyards of California. He understood now what the desert surrender had only hinted. America's democracy had turned industry itself into an artillery piece, and the echo of that barrage would shape the world long after the last shot was fired. Bremen, 1946. Evening fog curled like low smoke through streets still pocked by bomb craters. The scent of damp brick and coal dust clung to every broken wall. In the kitchen of his parents' half-ruined house, Hans Wecker unfolded a sheaf of letters written on American paper, their edges soft from travel. He read aloud to his sister, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who has seen both the fury of battle and the quiet strength of peace. The letters told of Camp Hearn's mess hall and the sugar beet fields of Iowa, of coffee so rich it seemed inexhaustible, and of wages, 80 cents a day in canteen scrip, that allowed a prisoner to buy chocolate or tobacco even in captivity. He described the Red Ball Express moving 12,500 tons of supplies each day, a logistical river that had drowned the Wehrmacht in arithmetic. He spoke of the Liberty and Victory ships, more than 3,000 of them launched in 4 short years, each built faster than the Kriegsmarine's U-boats could destroy. These were not boasts, they were observations, the facts of a democracy that had turned industry into an inexhaustible weapon. His father listened in silence, the glow of a single kerosene lamp catching the fine dust that drifted from the cracked ceiling. In the ruins of the Reich, where bread was scarce and fuel scarcer, Hans's stories of American abundance sounded almost like fairy tales. Yet, they were not. He carefully explained that American guards treated prisoners humanely, that courts had tried and executed the murderers of Johannes Kunze only after a full legal process. Even the enemy, Hans said quietly, received justice. Across the Atlantic, Corporal Rupert Trimmingham's 1944 letter still circulated in American newspapers and veterans' halls, sparking debates about the nation's own unfinished struggle with segregation. Black veterans carried his words into the emerging civil rights movement, proof that democracy's promise was both powerful and imperfect. Hans closed his final letter with a single line that his sister copied carefully. "If there is a land of opportunity, it is the one that defeated us, because it feeds even its enemies and argues with itself until it grows stronger." The words hung in the dim kitchen, an echo of something larger than personal memory, the recognition that freedom's strength lay not in uniformity, but in the ability to improve. Outside, church bells tolled faintly through the rubble, a sound of continuity amid collapse. Hans folded the letters and set them beside the lamp. The war had begun with promises of a 1,000-year Reich. It ended, for him, with the quiet conviction that a democracy's capacity for both abundance and self-critique would endure far longer. Decades later, a December sunset burnished the snow-covered streets of Algona, Iowa, with a light as soft as memory. Maggie O'Donnell, now gray-haired and walking with the careful steps of age, approached the small chapel where the POWs' nativity scene still stood. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine and candle wax. 65 half-life-size figures, carved and painted by German prisoners in 1945, glowed in the warm light. Shepherds with weathered faces, angels whose wings caught the flicker of every candle flame. Maggie remembered the frostbit mornings when Hans and his comrades had cut sugar beets in her fields, the steam of their breath mingling with her own as coffee and pie bridged the gap between enemies. She thought of the quiet dignity of Captain James Hollis, whose steady hand enforced the Geneva rules, and of the faraway letters Hans once sent to a ruined Bremen. The figures before her were more than art. They were the enduring evidence of an unlikely reconciliation. Across the ocean, Hans, an old man now, had long since told his grandchildren about the golden cage, a phrase he borrowed from fellow prisoners to describe American camps where enemies were treated with a humanity that defied Nazi propaganda. He would recall the impossible statistics: 96,318 warplanes in a single year, 2,710 Liberty ships built in less than 4, and speak of a nation whose strength lay not only in steel and oil, but in the moral confidence to be generous even in war. Corporal Trimmingham's letter lived on as well, cited by civil rights leaders who found in his wartime experience both an indictment and a challenge. America's contradictions had not vanished, but its willingness to confront them remained part of its strength. Maggie stood before the carved figures as evening shadows lengthened. The nativity glowed like a small miracle born of conflict, proof that even in war, hands that once bore rifles could shape something enduring and beautiful. She whispered a prayer for her husband who had returned from the Pacific long ago, for Hans across the sea, and for the generations who would inherit the freedoms purchased in blood and built in steel. Outside, the night deepened and a cold wind rattled the chapel's door. Inside, the candles burned steady, their light falling across the faces of shepherds and angels, silent witnesses to a victory measured not only in battles won but in hearts changed.